So automating security, things your mother didn't tell you about. You don't know me, so I've spent my career in a mix of development, operations, and InfoSec roles. For the past few years, I've been at Risk.io. We're a small software as a service startup that manages security issues. This talk doesn't really have a lot to do with our product per se, but it does have to do with how we secure our site and treat the data, our clients' data. We run entirely in the cloud, including our development environment. We'd like to dog food everything from the top on down, and sometimes that has security implications. We can't control who sees our network data, and we can't control who gets our hard drives after we reboot our servers. So automating security isn't really a new thing any more than automating infrastructure is a new thing. We use Chef and some third-party software as a service apps to do what we do. So I'm going to focus on that today. But really, you could do this with just about anything, be it Packer, Docker, Puppet. You could build it with operating system packages and a lot of scripting if you wanted. I suppose you could even do it in Emacs. So, show of hands, who thinks of security as their day-to-day job? All right, a few. So, do you think it's easy? No. No, security is hard. It's a very broad topic. It'll touch almost every piece of your infrastructure. And if you slip up, you're toast. You know, any mistake can be a vector in for an attacker. If you followed the recent coverage for Target, it looks like their most recent breach came in through their heating and air conditioning management interfaces. Talk about esoteric, right? So it's hard to do right, and any flaw can be exploited, which makes it pretty likely that I've missed something in my talk. So where do we start? We start with our apps. The same way that DevOps borrows from the sort of agile development methodologies of small changes, small bugs, we want to do the same thing with security. We want to make changes as lightly and as quickly as possible. We want to close the window for an attack to be small, rather than doing things like quarterly patch updates and having to make emergency requests to get in fixes for important things. So security is about managing risk. Your mom might have talked about this in a talk about making good choices. She might have suggested slowing down, making sure that you're absolutely sure you're making the right decision. A lot of security orgs work that way. You know, they'll take their time to make a decision, then they spend time to execute it. I'd like to advocate for making changes more quickly using the tooling that we have for DevOps, and doing away with things like Firewall change Fridays or quarterly OS patching. I think in the long run they do more harm than good to our overall security posture by leaving the windows of exploitability open longer, and they increase the chance that we're going to shoot ourselves in the foot and take down our site, whether or not it's for a security reason. So what next? Hosting. Hosting seems like a logical place to start. I don't really have a lot to say about hosting. We've designed our infrastructure to be rather hosting agnostic. I don't believe that there's much of a magic bullet in any host, and you still need to balance your particular requirements with what your host is capable of doing. So unicorns. There's a lot of great hosts that will allow you to get up and running quickly. But you need to be aware of your requirements. If you need to keep the data at rest in your environment encrypted, you may not be able to use something like Heroku or App Engine or even a data store as a service like RDS. But if it doesn't matter for your data, then go for it. So is there any secure hosting? There's Firehose. We don't use them. I don't know a lot about their internals. From their website, it looks like they do a lot of the things that I talk about. But networks. After your app, network security and access into your network and services is probably where you're going to spend most of your time securing things. If we're talking about transport security, if you are able to physically control your network, that's terrific. Make sure you still segment off things that don't belong or shouldn't be able to speak to production, like your HVAC system, if it's on there. Logically isolated networks, like VLANs, are probably how you would do that. And they also make a really good way, if you're in a hosted environment, to be segmented off from other clients. Do your research, though. If you're on a small host, make sure that you can get an audit report, something like a SAS 70, and make sure that what they're doing to keep your data away from your neighbor's data matches your needs. Another interesting way to protect the transport security is internally VPNing. So all your hosts either join a VPN or they speak to each other in a mesh host-to-host VPN. We went down this road for a bit ourselves. Eventually, we outgrew what we were able to do with IPsec internally. I think we could have made it work in the long run, but we chose to go the VPC route. And then you could always SSL everything to itself. That it gets difficult with certain configurations. Some applications you need to purchase the commercial version if you want SSL. That can get annoying. S-Tunnel and some other tools will be your friend if you get on that route. So network access. Host-based firewalls are Host-based firewalls are probably the simplest, easiest way to get into it. Chef has some great recipes for that. I'm sure Puppet and some of the others do as well. There are some meta firewall management apps that if you have both hardware and software, firewalls can be useful. And then AWS in particular has their logical security groups which operate like software firewalls based on your grouping of servers. You can do something similar with Chef and roles and host-based firewalls if you choose. We've had success with both the security groups and the host-based firewalls and Chef roles. So these are, IPtables is probably the oldest and main cookbook for managing a host-based firewall. Sorry. Fashion issue. And a couple more. There's a lot more in the community site. You'll probably find more on GitHub as well. Then auto firewalling. The idea here is to automatically block or shun any attackers. So if somebody's hitting your SSH on your Bastion host, that it'll automatically block them, putting in the IPtables rules. It works well for a single server setup. If you need multiple servers to collude and in order to make decisions, you may have to build your own using something like an IDS to your centralized logging, then talking back to your firewall or your WAF. Which brings us to WAFs. If you're not familiar, web app firewalls are meant to operate much like a host firewall. Any bad web request coming in is theoretically blocked. They're also handy if you have a bug in your application and you can't patch it quickly enough for whatever reason. You have a really long patch cycle or deploy cycle, but you know that there's a security vulnerability in your app. You can use the WAF as a way to mitigate those requests. So in the Chef community right now, there's the Mod Security Cookbook, which I wrote a few years ago and is very stale. So sorry for that. If anybody would like to take it over or would like to help with that, see me after the talk. There's a few services that operate like proxies, and you can use those as well. It's a relatively new space, and some seem to be a little more than mod security with a web front end, which is good. But you know, again, do your research on who you end up using. DOS protection. So you're probably going to get DOS'd, but it's probably not what you think it'll be. Most people think of a DOS as a network DOS, in that somebody floods your network with a whole bunch of traffic. That, unless you're a really large or a particular target, it's not terribly likely. You're more likely to have a really slow page somewhere in your application or your site, and somebody's going to hit it over and over and over again. Whether it's a real user or you got popular one day or scrapers. I hate scrapers. So this is a mix of different DOS mitigation apps. Some of these are more suited towards application DOS if you have a really slow page, or if people are just dedicated to really nailing your application. And others are aimed at network DOSs, which you may have a need for. So now the Bastion Host. If you're not familiar, Bastion Host is a hardened system to provide a gateway into your production environment. It's other than your load balancer or whatever your web front door is, it should really be the only way to get into your production environment. It should run as few services as possible. In our case, we run SSH and a VPN. I can't imagine needing much more. But the idea is to limit access as much as possible and to log it. And use two-factor. We'll get to that. So this is related to the chef cookbooks on SSH, but in addition, don't use passwords. Your mom wouldn't like it. No, there's not much additional security of using SSH passwords in addition to SSH keys at this point. Just don't. Make sure to check your keys that they have a passphrase, however. Set up a script, whatever you got to do. Make your people sign an affidavit. And then the OpenSSH and the user's cookbook make it relatively easy to manage. Do people still log into root? I hope not. So, if somebody needs to have the root password, generate it, print it out, don't look at it, mail it to your mom, have her keep it like in an envelope in her desk. Use sudo if you really need to become root, sudo to root. The user's cookbook makes it pretty easy to make sure that appropriate people have sudo. So VPN, OpenVPN has a good cookbook for Chef as well. Again, it integrates well with the user's cookbook. So two-factor. There's not much of an excuse to not be using two-factor, particularly on your Bastion host these days. We're big fans of DuoSec, so we released the Duo Unix cookbook at the top there because I didn't see that there was another one already. but it makes it very simple to add two-factor to your Bastion host or anything running SSH. I wouldn't recommend running it on every host. You'll drive yourself mad. And there's one excuse. Internally, we have OpenVPN working with DuoSec, but we haven't been able to split that out into a separate chef cookbook yet, but soon. If you're in desperate need of it, I'll be around. I can share the details of it. So servers are neat. They do lots of stuff. Automatic updates. We wrote our own to do this, though I didn't remember it until a few days ago. I really thought it was the apt cookbook that was doing our automatic updates of operating system packages. These are a couple that I was able to find on the community site. They seem sane, but I think ultimately in the chef community, what we need is sort of a meta upgrading cookbook that works similar to how the database cookbook works today with speaking to MySQL and Postgres. I understand the case made for things like quarterly or monthly updates of software to reduce, to pin the risk to a single day or period in time. I'm not a big fan of that. I prefer to allow most updates to happen as they come out and to pin or freeze the critical or unreliable packages. Things like our database packages, we're not going to allow MySQL to get automatically upgraded. Or you may know of some packages in your own environment that don't restart correctly when the RPM or deb gets upgraded. Regardless, if you don't want things to automatically update and you just want to get nagged when something has a vulnerability against it, there's a portion of the Cloud Passage app that will do that. So OS hardening. If you're unfamiliar, SE Linux is a kernel and core extension to the Linux OS that allows you to prevent programs from doing things they shouldn't. You create profiles, tells SE Linux what this program is allowed to do. If you get serious about using SE Linux and you're also using chef cookbooks that compile or you're compiling your own software, you likely will have to create some of your own profiles in addition to the ones provided by your OS vendor. And syscontrol has a cookbook. It talks to a lot of low-level tunables in Linux, and it's handy for tweaking lots of things, some of which are security-related, some of which are not. IDSs. So Snort's a network. IDS, OSSec, and AID are more host-based IDSs. And Cloud Passage will do some file integrity checking. What you're really looking for here is to be able to detect change on your systems. You want to know if files change, particularly if they're sensitive, things in bin, Etsy password, Etsy shadow, things of that nature. Opsmatic seems like a new player in the space. I don't think they're really targeting being an IDS, but they do a good job of showing you what's changing on your servers in a unique interface. So encrypting data at rest. This one's a relatively fun one for me. I never really got into the whole encrypt your hard drive on servers up until we entered the cloud. Laptops made sense. If somebody steals my laptop, they can look at the data on my drive. They might get your mom's tax returns. But from my servers, other than giving my hard drive away to somebody, the risk of somebody getting that data seems low, much lower than if they were able to hack into the server otherwise and just access the data while the server was running. But in the cloud, it's different. We don't know where our hard drives are going to go after we reboot that EC2 server. So since we operate entirely in the cloud, we encrypt the volumes that we are using. The first cookbook is ours and works with EBS and instance volumes. The second cookbook, there is a one-time encrypted volume cookbook, which is interesting. The third one works with some commercial software. I don't know a ton about it, but it seems to have been in the community for a bit. And encrypting backups. If somebody gets a copy of my backup, that's a bad deal. So we encrypt ours, we store them in S3. We'll release that in a cookbook soon. It'll likely be a lightweight resource like some of the others that we've released. And if you're not familiar with Tarsnap, it's a super secure file storage service. It's perfectly suited for storing your backups. There's a cookbook for it. It looks like it would do what you would need to get that done. And there's the option of using a network volume, something like EBS with the previous volume encryption cookbooks would allow you to have encrypted backups sitting on that volume. And centralized logging should really be the core of your security infrastructure. You want everything to go into some sort of log. Whether you build your own using something like Logstash or Splunk in your environment, or you throw it into the cloud, but be aware of what data is going in there. If you're outsourcing centralized logging to the cloud, you certainly don't want things like passwords ending up in there. Even if you're not outsourcing it, you probably don't want passwords in the logs. But really, you should try to log as much as you can stand. Anything from normal system events, log in, log out, to major application events, application exceptions, if you're not already using something else like Honey Badger, to every connection made in your environment. Seriously, we log every connection made within our environment to Logstash. It's just a game of time and resources and whether that data is useful to you. But it allows you to build dashboards and to run reports that you wouldn't be able to if you don't have the data. So testing. Securing things is really only part of the game. You need to test your work as much as you write good unit tests for your own code. So we're a Rails site. So these are some Ruby on Rails static analysis tools. Other languages or platforms would have others as well. Brakeman's a gem that'll read through it like Lint if you've ever used Lint. Code Climate integrates with GitHub and will check out any commits as they come in. But don't start doing static analysis unless you already have a reasonable test suite in place for your app. Otherwise, you will shoot yourself in the foot. Host and network vulnerability scanning. Qualys and Nessus have two very good products. Qualys is useful for testing from the outside. Nessus is very useful for testing from the inside. We've started a Nessus cookbook. It can install and set up users and such. It is a little bit brittle at the moment. The Nessus tools for that are not the easiest to work with, but we'll get it there. So web app scanning. Sentinel, Qualys, or White Hat and Qualys both have products that you can use to scan your app from the outside. There are some open source ones that'll work well. The idea here is to make sure that you get it on a schedule and fix things. So at this point, you've probably got a pile of vulnerabilities. You want to fix what matters. This is where our app would come in if you're using it, to find what is most likely to lead to an exploit and to automate. I don't know if I have time. So, war games. I've started a project that uses a couple Vagrant instances. And what we do is we provision an attacker and a defender. They're very simple at the moment. Right now, the defender creates an encrypted volume as a test and sets up two-factor. So if this takes too long, I'll cancel it. It should be set up as it is. All right, never mind. So I'll be sharing this project by the end of the week, but the idea here is to create a demo of all the security cookbooks that are reasonable in Chef. And I'd really like to have branches in other platforms as well. So if you're really good at security and Puppet, I'd love to chat. We can set up a branch and work on it that way. The other side of this is the attacker server, which would launch an Nmap scan against our defender. We'll see. If two-factor works. No, I'm not getting any network. Okay. But so more. I need help with the automated security. I'd really like to create a common language for DevOps and to talk about security and what things we should be doing and what things we shouldn't, and to have a good live example based on something like Vagrant or Docker for people that are not initiated to look at and to poke around with. The second link is where we've been putting cookbooks as we write them. Again, we use Chef. And then the last one is my stale, out-of-date, very, very sad mod security cookbook. T-shirts. We have a long-standing bug bounty. If you find any bugs in the cookbooks we've released or issue any pull requests, I've got a bunch of T-shirts that I brought with me. Come find me. And if you want to play around with the automated war games, and set up a non-chef branch or a chef solo branch or something, that would be wonderful. T-shirts. Thank you.